Good afternoon and welcome to this edition of Finweek Money Matters, the show that helps you manage your finances. I'm Alicia Seckham. My co-host this afternoon, Mark Ashton, who's of course editor of Finweek. Coming up on the show today, 1 in 3 prisoners in South Africa are awaiting trial detainees, and if considered low risk, they could be electronically tagged and released to decrease overcrowding in prisons. We pull the veil on the economics of prisons in the country. And then marriages face huge challenges, and the conundrum of finances may just be the crack in the vase. We tackle this and just how beneficial big data is in the company's daily operations as well. So 3 hot topics on the agenda this afternoon. Please do send any comments or feedback to moneymatters@abn360.com. The National Prosecuting Authority has been in the news for all the wrong reasons recently. Minister Jeff Radebe has defended the organisation by pointing to the number of people in prison. But if the Finweek cover story is to be believed, the economics of prisons in South Africa just isn't adding up. At the desk with me this afternoon is Jessica Hubbard from Finweek, James Self, Shadow Minister of Correctional Services, and Golden Miles Budu, President of the South African Prisoners Organisation for Human Rights. Welcome to you all. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. And Mark, let's perhaps just start off with you, because looking at some of the numbers, I mean, in 1994, there were 400 people in SA prisons with life sentences. Flash forward to 2013, we're sitting with 11,000. I mean, those are numbers that's got to get anybody's attention.
Sure, I think, look, there are a couple of things to look at. This story essentially, it takes its form from a discussion that came up between the writer James Stein and Jeff Radebe a couple of weeks back. Essentially, James hammered away at Jeff Radebe, saying he didn't agree with a lot of the statistics that were being rolled out. And the minister in turn responded, saying that the prosecuting authorities, the justice system is working in South Africa. If you simply look at the number of people that are currently being processed in the prison system. But we're now looking at a situation where essentially you've got between 30 and 50,000 people incarcerated, more people incarcerated than what you have in the capacity for. And we've all heard the horror stories of what happens in prisons, how the system is cracking, and the economics don't add up. And minor offenders, waiting trial detainees, everybody's being chucked into this pool, and they're then being released back into society after placing an enormous economic strain. I mean, there are a couple of ways of looking at it, but one of them argues that each detainee in South Africa costs nearly 10,000 rand per month.
Absolutely.
And this is something that taxpayer is seeing as a month-to-month cost, and then seeing as a societal cost post being released from prison. So I think there's some very interesting figures to look at there.
Various facets that we've got to consider here. James, let's perhaps start off at the top, because the increase we're looking at, is it as a result of government getting tougher in handing down sentences, crime on the rise, or South Africa having done away with the death penalty to start off with?
Well, I think the number of life sentence prisoners has to do with the fact that we don't have a death penalty any longer, and many of the offences that used to be capital offences are now life sentence offences. But there are far too many people in our prison system who shouldn't be there. You referred earlier to awaiting trial detainees or remand detainees. Many of those people sit for 5, 6, 7 months in prison only to find that the cases against them are dropped through lack of evidence. So those sorts of people should be released out with a tracking device if necessary. But also there are a number of people that are in prison who are in prison for relatively minor, non-violent, first-time offences. Those sorts of people should get community-based sentencing. They should be tagged. They should be seen out on the streets cleaning up rubbish. They should be put to work, and in that way make a visible restitution to the society.
Golden, let's bring you into the conversation at this point, because where numbers are the problem here, where combating crime has been declared a national government priority, how are you rating the prioritization here and the effectiveness of our criminal judicial system?
Well, from where I'm sitting, being a veteran ex-offender, prisoners' rights activist, the system doesn't work. and it won't work until such time you get people who are passionate in what they're doing to make the system work. There are policies here in and here out. The Constitution, the Bill of Rights, everything is there. The implementation thereof just doesn't exist. And we as an organization has for years on end, after extensive research in Scandinavian countries, in Europe, came back and make presentations then to the Portfolio Committee on Correctional Services, and apparently whatever we said there was never taken seriously. It was like when you go in there, you come with well-researched stuff and say, look guys, you are the lawmakers, can't we try this, you know? And then you bump into people with cold eyes and hard faces, you know, who won't tell it as it is, but say maybe afterwards that they know better than what you came here for. Now we're sitting here and our prison population is booming and booming. And out of desperation, this is not out of desperation, sentenced and unsentenced prisoners and ex-prisoners and their relatives, including the victims of crime and criminals, said 5, 6, 7 years ago, Miles, maybe we need a political solution for this problem. And they encouraged us from outside to go and register a political party for the sector within this field. And we have done that, and we are looking now for a political organization that we can maybe align with and form a coalition, and maybe after the 2014 elections, politically get to the root causes of what we see has become a decadence and a bravado.
James, maybe something to throw to you though. I mean, who can we compare ourselves to, that a system that works? I think that, you know, it's difficult to compare ourselves to, for instance, Scandinavian, a country where unemployment is low. There's a lot of societal benefits that we don't enjoy in South Africa.
Yes.
Who can we compare ourselves to and benchmark ourselves against ultimately if we're saying, you know, here's a solution that we can adopt as South Africa?
Yes.
South Africa.
Well, look, I think many African countries have a very good a system of prisons. Uganda, Zimbabwe even, where the emphasis is on putting people to work rather than warehousing criminals, skilling people before they get released, dealing with remand detainees in a more effective way. But all of them accept the truism that actually you are likely to emerge from prison more criminalized than when you went in, because of the lack of rehabilitation, because of the overcrowding, and because basically the people who run the prisons aren't skilled enough to deal with the rehabilitation of offenders.
Alicia, sorry, just to cut in there, I'd like to point out that it seems to be a critical problem is the administration of the Department of Correctional Services. I mean, they don't even have a CFO at the moment. So when we're talking about aligning budget with strategic directions, to not even have a CFO at the helm, they just seem to be in chaos. So how can we have an operational system when the department managing it is in chaos?
Yes, well, you're quite right. I mean, we've had 4 national commissioners in the last 8 years. We have had 3 CFOs. The post is vacant for substantial periods. Those posts have been filled by acting incumbents. And until such time as there is a clear direction from the top, the sort of change that we're talking about isn't going to happen, because that department, more than any other, is dysfunctional in many respects and needs very, very firm leadership.
They also don't seem to be getting the budget that's required to initiate some of the policies that
Well,
you've been
yes.
talking
I mean,
about.
if you are looking about the core business of correctional services, which is the rehabilitation of offenders and their reintegration into society, at the moment, roughly 6% of the budget is spent on rehabilitation and roughly 4% of the budget is spent on reintegration. And we've had this very recent case of a brutal murder in the Western Cape of Dr. Louis Haynes, where one of the people accused of that has had 4 previous jail convictions, 18 previous, or 4 times in prison and 18 previous convictions, released out onto the street with no support systems, no ability to reintegrate into society, and then we wonder why there's a crime problem.
So if you're talking about this technology stepping into the fray, and here we're referring to the electronic monitoring system to actually control things, get those remand prisoners out, and into society until they await their trial. What do you make of that coming to the fore sooner rather than later? Because what you touched on was more a political framework that needs to be in place. What do you make of a system like this?
Well, look, the system that you're talking about is as old as the mountains in other countries. It's not as if the lawmakers and the politicians never heard of it. It's not as if they never went there and experienced it happening in Scandinavian countries and in Europe. It's just the world. And let me say this in addition. I didn't know that I was going to sit next to Mr. James Howell, And I came here with a document which was prepared by the Democratic Alliance in 2005 entitled Prison Work When Prisoners Work. Now, if this document was taken seriously, let's say at least as 2-3 years ago, you're going to have a situation where no prisoner is going to have a free lunch. It is a document that says if you get arrested, you get charged, prosecuted, imprisoned, you are no more going to eat and lay. If you get there and you've got skills, immediately you start to work and you start to sweat for your stay. And then thereafter, you start to pay tax. You become a taxpayer as an incarcerated person. You start to pay for your medication, for your food, and you put money into a family trust fund if you left the family outside, and you even put money into a victim's trust fund and so on. The only thing that we didn't agree with the Democratic Alliance then, and even up to now in terms of the document, is that we were saying if you industrialize these institutions, you must also let inmates belong to a labor movement, unionize them, so that you...
That's a very hot topic in the
Yes.
current context.
So what you do there, and it's not as if intellectuals, lawyers, big brains, judges, and entrepreneurs never spoke about the idea long before we bumped into it in other countries. There was a document called the Parallax Corporation, where Judge Kathy Satchell and Judge Edwin Cameron and Fed Shaw and Investec Business Against Crime worked on a document. How are they going to get involved if these prisons get industrialized? Because I come from a background where I believe the majority of the people of this country were not given the necessary skills to become responsible citizens. Why don't we start post-1994 and make them productive, law-abiding citizens
So
in
let's
and outside?
pose the question to James. James, where do the bottlenecks sit? Where do the challenges sit in actually getting this blueprint into practice?
Well, I think at the moment there's a lack of will on the part of the department to actually take people outside of prison and into a working environment. So when I went to Malmesbury Prison a couple of months ago, they have 5 workshops there. Only 1 workshop was in operation. Now, I had to ask myself the question, why weren't all 5 on fully operational basis? I was told people were on leave, there was a lack of skills, there weren't enough technicians, there weren't enough artisans, there were 101 excuses. But what is needed is a can-do attitude and the political will to put this into operation, because I believe it can operate. It operates in many other countries that are not as developed as us, and if it operates in Zimbabwe, it can operate in South Africa.
Miles, I think one of the things that I hear this and it sounds great in practice, but the reality is once you're convicted of a crime in South Africa or even charged with a crime in South Africa, the future is very bleak for you. We already sit in a situation where unemployment sits somewhere between 25 and 40%, depending on what metric you use. It's very difficult to come out of the prison system and be able to then become a productive member of society. There's no there's no natural way to be able to reintegrate, and I suspect that it's a situation in a lot of countries. It's emphasized because of our level of unemployment. how do we deal with that part of the equation? Because it's one thing to put a prisoner to work inside a prison, get them out there and put them back into society. How do we bridge that gap?
Well, my understanding is that the democratization process, in my reading, was meant to rectify the mistakes that was done by the previous apartheid regime.
Sure.
Okay, that is my understanding. And I'm sitting here almost 20 years down the line, and I think it has not started yet. I might be mistaken, because the critics would say, and the cynics, must I commit a crime, become a criminal, and go to prison so that I become a law-abiding citizen? I must become productive, I must get skills, education, and train, and come out being useful. Well, if that is the case, then there is something terribly wrong in the society. Again, we're going back to the political world. It's almost 20 years now. What is happening after 20 years?
Can I make a practical suggestion in that respect? There are a number of farms that have been appropriated for land restitution. Not all of them have been reallocated. Now, a lot of the prisoners who do time are trained in agricultural skills. And we are trying to interest the department in acquiring a number of these farms, and when people are released on parole, to actually put them onto these farms so that they can continue to carry out the skills that they learned in prison while reintroducing them into the market economy. Now, that is one such idea. The other big problem lies in criminal records. And at the moment, you have to wait 10 years before you can expunge a criminal record. And just about nobody, for very understandable reasons, is prepared to employ somebody with a criminal record. So we are saying that if you have a first-time offender who has fulfilled all their parole and rehabilitation requirements satisfactorily, that their criminal record should be expunged, thus allowing them a better prospect of getting back into employment.
But devil's advocate's going to argue that as the employer, you want to know that information. I mean, how do you? It's a very tough trade-off for the economy in terms of competition's already so fierce for jobs, and if you know that you can exclude certain people because of a criminal record,
but then you are effectively consigning that person to permanent unemployment.
Sure.
That person will then inevitably commit another crime and go back inside, and we'll have the revolving door syndrome. Somebody's got to have the imagination, somebody's got to take the risk to break that cycle.
We're talking about those with criminal records. The figure that still startles me is this 45,043 that are waiting trial still. I mean, that's 30% of those that are in prison right now. How do we make sure we're dealing with a more efficient judicial system so that we don't have this problem? It's one thing bringing electronics into the game and putting them into, on an electronic monitoring system, but then you've got to question the effectiveness of that. What happens when they commit another crime? Do they go back in, get another ankle bracelet put on? How do you start getting a handle of that situation?
Well, clearly somebody who is released on bail is typically not somebody who's a violent offender or somebody who's accused of a violent offence. But what you typically find in many prisons is that people have got bail of 100 Rand and 200 Rand and 300 Rand, and they can't afford it. And so what you're doing is you're now spending 10,000 Rands a month for somebody who can't afford 300 Rands bail. That's mad. And so what we're saying is, let's release those sorts of criminals who've got relatively low levels of bail with an electronic tagging device, and at the same time, let us organize the criminal justice system in such a way that you can consolidate charges, for example, so that a person only appears in one court for multiple offenses, instead of being convicted in one court and then being convicted in another court and then a third court and so on. That's just inefficient, plainly inefficient. But part of the problem is that the Department of Correctional Services doesn't even know who their own customers are. They're supposed to have a computer system called the Remand Offender and Detainee Management System, RDOMS, and it's collapsed. So we don't know who's in prison. We don't know on what charges they're being held. And That system doesn't talk to the justice system, it doesn't talk to the police system, and it's time, as I said, that there's political will, imagination, and determination to put it right.
James, just a quick question. How big is the problem of prisoners or people awaiting trial who have actually been wrongfully accused? I mean, is that a big issue at the moment? Is inefficient policing a big problem?
I think there is a big tendency by police officers who are judged by their arrest record to arrest somebody, perhaps not with enough evidence, perhaps on flimsy accounts of other people, because now you've ticked a box, you've got your person, and many of the people who find themselves in that situation can spend, as I said, up to 6 months in remand detention, only to find that there's no evidence against them and they get released. In the meantime, they've lost their job, or they've dropped out of school, or they've met some really bad people and joined a gang, or they have in some other way been sucked into the criminal justice system, and that becomes a compounding problem.
Miles, you spoke about political will, and we've heard both guests have spoken about political will, but that almost feels like externalizing the problem. It's somebody else needs to take responsibility for it. Who do we look to for leadership around this problem? And it can't simply be a political party. I mean, there've got to be movements that people need to be aware of, that are out there, that are specifically trying to tackle it. Who holds the key?
You look for people. You must look for people that want to roll up their sleeves and get their hands dirty. Really do it the way it's supposed to be done. There is no blueprint here, because no one in my book was born a criminal.
Sure.
I'm sitting here, as I said earlier on, I referred to a document called An Alternative System of Rehabilitative, Profit-Motivated and Self-Financing Penal Management. It's an old document, but it is also, it's got copyright, you know. And here were people, some years ago, that wanted to get their hands dirty. But maybe because of they were not in favor of certain people in right places. This document got dusted, but it is still here, and I'm making it relevant as a veteran offender, veteran ex-offender. And I'm not sitting here and want to be pushy-footing and be soft against crime and criminals.
Sure.
This is the Republic of South Africa. If you commit a crime here, you will be arrested. If you have gotten away the first time, the second time, the third time, but don't count your stars too high. You will get arrested, and technology is so advanced. You will be on remand, a further charge remand, and you will be arrested, charged, prosecuted, and you will do your time. We are not soft on crime and criminality. All we are saying is that let's all go out there, get our hands dirty, and give these guys a second chance, because they are white, black, grey, blue, and violent criminal offenders. And I am the chief of staff of all these criminals. You know why? If you want to commit a crime, I'll give you my cell number. You must call me, and I will tell you, and I'll advise you, I will counsel you. Stay away, don't do that, because crime doesn't pay, you will get arrested. Now, I'm sitting here and I'm bleeding under my collar. It's almost 20 years, and the crime is getting worse, and our prisons are getting overcrowded, and people who were there before should have known by now what needs to be done to try and make sense out of this nonsense of people get arrested, charged, prosecuted, go out of prison and go back again. The revolving door.
Well, certainly not enough time to unpack this story even further, so let's leave it there. Gentlemen, thanks so much for having joined us this afternoon. James Self is Shadow Minister of Correctional Services, and Golden Miles Budu is President of the South African Prisoners Organisation for Human Rights. Remember that you'll be able to get the full story in this week's Finweek. That's available in English and Afrikaans. It's out tomorrow morning, and I promise you it's a riveting read. Time now for a quick look at our Finweek Trade of the Day. So the spotlight on you, Mark. Trade of the week?
Yeah, so BuildMax. I mean, I was actually joking just before we came on air. I seem to be getting the small caps right, and the big ones seem to go the opposite direction. So I decided we'll stick to one of the small caps this week. BuildMax, it's a construction, mining supply business. I've been looking at it for a while now. It's owned about 80% bit by Brayton Coronation. It's quite an interesting business in that they bought into it at R1.10 a share. It fell all the way to about 10 cents a share before they've reconsolidated the shareholding in it. What's very interesting about it, they're finally back to profit. It's taken them a long time to get there. They're trading, the reason it kind of caught my eye is trading about R1.85 at the moment, but that's just been, and after the last set of financial results, if it was sitting at, after the consolidation, it was about R2.25. That put it on a price to earnings multiple of about 7 times earnings. The net asset value for that is about R3.25, so you're buying at a significant discount to net asset value. It's dropped beneath R2, which is beneath the consolidation level. So I think if you're a cheeky buyer, you might be able to pick up 1 or 2 options there.
How much of your confidence in the stock is reliant on the fact that you've got players like Brayton Coronation that are heavily invested?
Sure, I think, look, they're smart investors. They spot value. I mean, we can always look back and say it hasn't worked out perfectly for Brayton. They were buyers at R1.40. They were buyers at R1.10. They got hurt all the way down to 10 or 15 cents or wherever it got down to. Reality is the business is sound. There's a huge opportunity for infrastructure. There's going to be huge opportunities in the coal mining industry. They've just signed a big deal in the middle of Africa in conjunction with Exxaro. So I think that there's enough here to say there's